In October 1871, Lieutenant Robert Carter and the 4th Cavalry were tasked with the perilous mission of hunting down the Comanche, a challenge fraught with danger and uncertainty. The relentless Comanche raids had turned the frontier into an uninhabitable region for settlers. Just 2 years earlier, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, connecting the coasts. Yet a vast expanse of land at the heart of the country, Comancheria, remained unconquered and fiercely defended. The harsh conditions of the high plains, combined with the unyielding resistance of its inhabitants, made Comancheria a no-man's land. For decades, wagon trains and soldiers venturing into this territory vanished without a trace, leaving behind only chilling rumors of their fate. The region had become a place of whispered nightmares for those living on its fringes. For settlers on the borders of Comancheria, these fears materialized as an alarming rise in Comanche raids. As Lieutenant Carter entered this treacherous territory, he was fully aware that while he came as the hunter, he might well end up the hunted. Was the army truly prepared to confront the Comanche, whose mastery of the land and ferocious tactics had long made them the dominant force on the frontier? 2 years into Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, it was becoming evident that his Indian policies were faltering. Though pragmatic in some aspects and idealistic in others, Grant understood that the nation's expansion westward was inevitable. His policies, however, struggled to address the growing tensions between settlers and native tribes. The painting American Progress by John Gast captures the essence of this era. As settlers pushed westward, buoyed by the infrastructure and ambition of the United States, they claimed land while displacing Native Americans and decimating the buffalo herds, the lifeblood of many indigenous communities. Grant's policy toward Native Americans centered around assimilation, a concept he believed could protect indigenous tribes from the encroachment of white settlers. In a letter to General William T. Sherman, Grant expressed hope that his policies would shield Native communities while guiding them toward what he deemed a civilized existence, marked by Christianity and societal integration. These ideals, though controversial, were clearly articulated in his first inaugural address. Yet, what happens when a group refuses to accept foreign religions or a way of life imposed upon them? Among those who resisted with unmatched determination were the Comanche. Known as one of the most powerful and fearsome tribes, the Comanche had become synonymous with dominance across the western plains. Their reputation was built not only on their mastery of warfare, but also on the devastating toll their raids took on settlers and rival tribes alike. No other native group in the West could rival the death and destruction attributed to them. As American settlers pushed deeper into Comancheria, the number of violent conflicts escalated. Life on the edges of this territory became perilous, with settlers frequently falling victim to Comanche raids. These raids, often carried out with their Kiowa allies, were noted for their brutal efficiency. For those who lived along the fringes of the frontier, survival was a constant struggle, and fear of the Comanche loomed large. Grant's commitment to peace began to falter as reports of settler casualties mounted. Military leaders expressed growing concern over the exodus of settlers abandoning the frontier. One colonel famously warned, "If the Indian marauders are not punished, the whole country seems in a fair way of becoming totally depopulated." These words underscored the growing frustration among both settlers and military officials, who increasingly viewed peaceful policies as insufficient against groups like the Comanche. By 1871, public and military sentiment had begun to shift. The tipping point came that year during one of the most brutal and horrifying raids ever recorded. This singular event forced both the government and military to reconsider their stance, marking the beginning of a more aggressive approach to dealing with the Comanche and their allies. On May 18, 1871, a wagon train of 12 men was making its way across Salt Creek Prairie, carrying vital supplies for the forts in Texas. As they moved through the vast plains, their journey took a harrowing turn. They spotted a large band of warriors, both Kiowa and Comanche, on the horizon. Henry Warren, the leader of the wagon train, acted quickly. He ordered his men to form a defensive circle, a tactic commonly used in such encounters. Yet against over 100 seasoned warriors, their efforts were futile. The Comanche and Kiowa descended upon the train with overwhelming force, leaving the men little chance to defend themselves. In the chaos, 5 members of the wagon train managed to escape. The warriors, distracted by looting the supplies, did not pursue the fleeing men. One survivor, desperate and determined, reached Fort Richardson and recounted the massacre to the soldiers stationed there. Lieutenant Robert Carter and a detachment of the 4th Cavalry were sent to investigate. What they found shocked even the battle-hardened soldiers. Carter later wrote, "There could be nothing more appalling, heart-rendering, or sickening to the human senses than the spectacle of the Salt Creek Prairie Massacre. The poor victims were stripped, scalped, and horribly mutilated. The scene was indeed horrifying. 7 men lay dead, their bodies pierced by countless arrows, resembling human porcupines. Some victims had been decapitated. One man, who evidently fought back, suffered a gruesome fate, captured, tied to a wagon wheel, and burned alive over a fire. In a twist of fate, General William T. Sherman and his small party had passed by the area just an hour earlier, narrowly avoiding an attack. This coincidence marked a significant turning point, as Sherman quickly called upon Colonel Ranald S. McKenzie, known as Bad Hand due to a wartime injury, to lead efforts in bringing the perpetrators to justice. McKenzie, a seasoned Civil War veteran, was still learning how to navigate the unique challenges of warfare on the high plains. His leadership would prove pivotal in the U.S. military's campaign against the Comanche. In the aftermath of the massacre, arrests came swiftly. A prominent Kiowa chief, Satanta, openly admitted to leading the attack. Satanta justified the violence by citing the U.S. government's broken promises, failure to provide the goods promised to his people, and plans to build railroads through their territory. He and a few other chiefs were convicted and imprisoned for the killings. This event signaled a dramatic shift in U.S. policy toward native tribes. The mounting destruction on the frontier was becoming too severe to ignore. Settlers reported hundreds of deaths over the years, pleading for Sherman to take decisive action. Although the Salt Creek Massacre was primarily orchestrated by the Kiowa, the Comanche, specifically the Guahadi band, were notorious for their frequent and devastating raids. The Guahadi, known as the most unyielding and hostile of the Comanche, had long refused to submit to treaties or reservation life. They would not even trade directly with whites. Ironically, their chief, Quanah Parker, was the product of a Comanche raid. In 1836, Cynthia Ann Parker was captured as a child during an attack on Parker Fort. She was adopted by the Comanche, later marrying the chief Petanocona. Their son, Quanah, would rise to become the final and legendary chief of the Comanche. For decades, the Guahadi terrorized wagon trains and Texas Rangers who dared to approach their territory. They were expert horsemen, cunning strategists, and deadly warriors. By the 1870s, they had acquired firearms, but their traditional bows remained their most lethal weapon. With arrows capable of reaching targets up to 60 yards away, a skilled Comanche archer could fire 20 shots per minute. By September 1871, the military finally received orders to act. General Sherman declared that the Guahadi must be punished and pursued. The era of hesitation had ended. It was time to confront the Comanche in their own land, the so-called Wolf's Den. The mission was clear: bring the Guahadi to the reservation by force or eliminate them entirely. But as Lieutenant Carter and his men knew, finding them was only part of the challenge. Surviving the encounter would prove to be just as difficult. The Guahadi, a fiercely independent band of the Comanche, inhabited a region known as the High Plains, an unforgiving expanse that was the last part of the country to be subdued by the U.S. military. And for good reason. The land was a natural fortress. Its harsh climate and challenging geography made it both a sanctuary for the Comanche and a nightmare for any would-be invaders. S.C. Gwynne, in his acclaimed work Empire of the Summer Moon, vividly captures the brutality of this region. Not only were the high plains generally without timber and water, they were also subject to one of the least hospitable climates in North America. In the summer came brutal heat and blowtorch winds, often 100 degrees or hotter, that would later destroy whole crops in a matter of days. The winds caused the eyes to burn, the lips to crack, and the body to dehydrate with alarming speed. In the fall and winter, there was a frequent norther, a sudden strong wind from the north, often at gale force. A norther could send the temperature plunging by 50 degrees in an hour. A blue norther had the additional feature of freezing-driven rain. One particularly infamous area within the high plains was the Llano Estacado, or the Staked Plains, named by early Spanish explorers. The name reflected the terrain's featureless expanse, an endless sea of grassland where one could easily lose their way without physical markers. General Randolph Marcy, in an 1852 report to the U.S. Army, described the Llano Estacado as a view presented itself as boundless as the ocean. Not a tree, shrub, or any other object, either animate or inanimate, relieved the dreary monotony. It was a vast, illimitable expanse of desert prairie, the Great Sahara of North America. It is a region almost as vast and trackless as the ocean. Marcy believed no one could live permanently in such a desolate place. Yet he was wrong. The Guahadi thrived here, turning the region's harshness to their advantage. As a horse tribe, the high plains were not a limitation, but a lifeline. The flat terrain served as natural highways, enabling the Guahadi to traverse astonishing distances in a single day. Their horses, a cornerstone of their way of life, found ample grazing land across the plains. Though water sources were scarce, the Guahadi knew every hidden spring and stream, giving them a critical edge over outsiders who ventured into their domain. Perhaps most importantly, the high plains were home to the buffalo, the lifeblood of the Comanche people. Buffalo provided food, shelter, clothing, and tools. To the Guahadi, they were more than a resource. They were a sacred and indispensable part of their culture. This was a land worth defending at all costs. The Comanche mastery of horseback warfare made them an unparalleled force in North America, a reputation they maintained well into the 1840s. For decades, slow-moving armies posed little threat to them. The Comanche chose their battles strategically, engaging only when the odds were in their favor. Their arrows, expertly crafted and shot with remarkable speed and precision, were far superior to the cumbersome, muzzle-loading rifles used by their adversaries. This advantage, however, began to wane as technology evolved. In 1844, the Texas Rangers introduced a revolutionary weapon to the battlefield, the Colt revolver. This game-changing firearm featured a 5-round cylinder that allowed for rapid firing, a stark contrast to the slow reload of older rifles. Rangers, keen on maintaining firepower during skirmishes, carried preloaded cylinders they could quickly swap, ensuring continuous fire. The effectiveness of this new technology was proven at the Battle of Walker's Creek, where rapid-fire tactics demonstrated their potential to challenge the Comanche on more equal terms. By the 1870s, firearm technology had advanced even further. The American cavalry now wielded Spencer carbines, highly accurate rifles with a 7-round magazine. The lever-action mechanism enabled a rate of fire comparable to that of a skilled Comanche archer, but at much greater range. This technological leap finally gave the U.S. military the tools needed to engage the Comanche in sustained battles. Yet even with these advancements, the Comanche still held a critical advantage. They didn't have to fight unless they wanted to. The vast, open plains were their greatest ally. Comanche warriors often traveled with multiple horses, keeping some rested and ready for high-speed retreats or pursuits. Pursuing them was a dangerous endeavor. The plains were an ocean of grass, where losing one's bearings was easy, and supply lines stretched thin. Without intimate knowledge of the terrain, finding water could become a life-or-death challenge. And all of this assumed that you didn't lose your horse, an essential lifeline on the unforgiving plains. Many Texas Rangers lost their lives attempting to match the Comanche in their own domain. The Comanche's mastery of the environment, combined with their tactical brilliance, made them nearly invincible. No one had yet proven capable of defeating them decisively on their home turf. It wasn't until Colonel Ranald S. McKenzie, known as Bad Hand due to a severe war injury, was given the unprecedented order not just to defend the settlers on the Texas frontier, but to actively hunt the Comanche in the heart of their homeland. In late September 1871, Lieutenant Robert Carter received orders from Colonel Ranald S. McKenzie to track down the elusive Quahadi Comanche. Finding the main village was no simple task. The Quahadi were masters of evasion, constantly moving to avoid detection. The mission led Carter and his men to the area near Blanco Canyon, east of the Caprock Escarpment. This region, with its low rolling plains, ravines, and canyons, was an ideal hiding spot for the Comanche, especially during their frequent raids in the fall. McKenzie's force was formidable, 600 men, primarily cavalry from the 4th Regiment. Among them were 20 Takwa scouts, fierce enemies of the Comanche and expert trackers. It was hoped their skills and knowledge would provide a crucial advantage. Yet Carter observed hesitation among the Takwas. While their bravery was unquestionable, he wondered whether they truly wished to confront the Comanche. Their instincts, honed over years of experience, seemed to hint at caution. For 10 long days, the expedition found no trace of the Quahadi. But on the evening of October 9th, everything changed. The Takwas noticed something unusual: 4 Comanche riders in the distance, silently watching the Americans. It was unclear how long they had been there. Perhaps they had been observing the Americans all along, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. Or maybe their presence was a deliberate message, letting the Americans know they were being watched. When the scouts tried to give chase, the Comanche relied on a classic tactic: fresh mounts. Their well-rested horses outpaced the military's exhausted ones, and the Comanche quickly vanished into the rolling hills near Blanco Canyon. The Takwas were convinced the Americans were close to the Quahadi village, but this also meant they were dangerously near to their adversaries. That night, the Americans made critical errors in their camp. Fires were lit for light and warmth, serving as beacons on the dark plains. Some regiments left their horses unguarded, confident that the Comanche wouldn't return. As midnight approached, the camp was quiet, save for the grazing sounds of horses tied at their lariats. Carter later recounted the events of that night in his book, On the Border with McKenzie. He described the stillness being shattered by a blood-curdling yell, followed by a gunshot. In an instant, chaos erupted. Carter wrote, "A yell followed by a shot rang down the valley. Then, in succession of unearthly, blood-curdling yells, a dozen shots in quick succession, one after the other, a rush, and in an instant, our whole camp was aroused. The ridge or line of small foothills which skirted our entire camp was alive with wild Indians, riding at full speed, shaking dry buffalo robes, ringing bells, and yelling like wild demons. The attack was swift and calculated. Officers shouted commands as the soldiers tried to regain their composure. Then Carter realized the Comanche's true objective: the horses. Amid the chaos, the thunderous sound of a stampede roared through the camp. The Comanche had succeeded in driving the animals away, leaving soldiers scrambling to grab the lariats. The leather tore through their hands as the herds of horses disappeared into the darkness, carried off by the Comanche. By the time the dust settled, 70 horses and mules were lost. A large portion of the force was left stranded without mounts. The Comanche didn't need to continue their attack. Their strategy was simple yet devastating: deprive the soldiers of their horses, then let the harsh geography of the plains do the rest. Without mounts, the Americans were effectively immobilized, unable to carry sufficient supplies or reach water sources. The attack was a masterstroke of Comanche strategy. They had been watching the camp, waiting for the right moment to strike. Their timing was perfect, and their knowledge of the terrain gave them the upper hand. The unguarded horses provided an easy target, and the Comanche delivered a crippling blow without suffering a single casualty. Carter later described this as the first tragedy of Blanco Canyon. It was a stark reminder of the tactical brilliance of the Comanche and the perils of underestimating their expertise in warfare. 3 more tragedies would follow, but this first strike set the tone for the challenges to come. In late September 1871, Lieutenant Robert Carter and his men received orders to track down the elusive Quahadi Comanche. After an ambush the previous night had cost the army over 70 horses, Carter knew their next move was critical. By morning, the Takwa scouts, known for their tracking skills, picked up the trail of the stampeding horses. Carter, joined by Captain Edward Hale and a group of soldiers, set out to recover what they could. Among the group was Private Sander Gregg, a man Carter trusted implicitly, along with other seasoned companions. However, the remaining soldiers under Hale's command were inexperienced recruits, men Carter had never served with before. The group followed the trail for about 2 miles when they spotted a small band of Comanche rounding up some of the stolen horses. The Comanche immediately fled on horseback, leading the soldiers into the treacherous terrain of ravines and arroyos. Carter and the others gave chase, unaware they were being lured into a trap. As they crested a small hill, Carter and his men saw the full scale of the danger they had walked into. Below them, at the base of the bluff, the ground was alive with mounted Comanche warriors. Hundreds of them, their bodies painted for war and adorned with feathered headdresses, charged toward the soldiers with blood-curdling whoops and yells. Captain Hale was the first to speak. "Heavens, but we are in a nest." Carter knew their situation was dire. With no cover and vastly outnumbered, they would have to retreat carefully to survive. Carter quickly ordered the men to spread into a line, using suppressive fire from their Spencer carbines to slow the Comanche advance. He hoped the sound of gunfire would alert the main force, prompting Colonel McKenzie to send reinforcements. The Comanche hesitated momentarily, but their numbers and ferocity soon overcame the advantage of the soldiers' superior weaponry. Among the warriors, a commanding figure emerged, Quanah Parker, the Quahadi chief. Covered in black war paint, his presence exuded a terrifying mix of authority and menace. As Carter watched, he noticed Parker at the forefront, rallying his warriors and driving them forward. Behind the warriors, Carter could hear the cries of Comanche women, urging their men to press the attack. He realized they had stumbled upon a Comanche village, the heart of the Quahadi stronghold. Amid the chaos, panic began to set in. Captain Hale and several of his inexperienced recruits broke ranks, attempting to flee on horseback. Carter, furious at their desertion, yelled for them to hold their ground, but it was too late. The Comanche, mounted on fresh horses, would easily outrun them. As Carter predicted, the fleeing soldiers were swiftly hunted down and killed. With Hale and his men gone, the focus of the Comanche shifted back to Carter and the remaining 5 soldiers. The group continued to retreat toward the arroyo, using their carbines to hold the Comanche at bay. The soldiers dismounted and used their horses as shields, but the relentless attacks took their toll. Arrows flew with deadly precision, striking 2 of Carter's men, one in the hand, another in the arm. The Comanche tightened their circle, their long poles adorned with scalps waving like macabre trophies. Carter ordered his men to keep firing, knowing their only chance lay in making a final dash for cover. As the moment came, Carter gave the order, "Now men, bunch your shots, pump it into them, and make a dash for your lives. It is all we can do." With a final volley, the soldiers mounted their horses and raced toward the arroyo. Private Sander Gregg, riding just 10 yards to Carter's right, suddenly shouted that his horse was faltering. Carter turned to see Quanah Parker and a group of warriors closing in, their horses thundering across the plains. Parker, smeared in black war paint, exuded a terrifying, almost inhuman joy. Carter described him as the incarnation of savage, brutal joy, with his features made even more fearsome by the war paint. Parker expertly maneuvered his horse, using Gregg's slower mount as cover to avoid Carter's line of fire. Carter yelled for Gregg to draw his 6-shooter, but it was too late. Parker rode alongside Gregg, raised his pistol, and fired. Gregg fell from his horse, dead. Carter watched in horror as the scene unfolded, powerless to intervene. This was the second tragedy of Blanco Canyon. With his men battered and morale shaken, Carter fully expected that he and the remaining soldiers would meet the same fate. But then their fortunes shifted. Without even stopping to take a trophy, Quanah Parker and the Comanche warriors abruptly turned and retreated. For a brief, surreal moment, Lieutenant Robert Carter realized their lives had been spared. Then he saw the reason why. Cresting a distant hill, the Toccoa scouts appeared, charging into view with war whoops and screams, rallying to join the fight. Behind them, a massive cloud of dust rose on the horizon. McKenzie had heard the gunfire, just as Carter had hoped, and the main force was now advancing to their aid. Carter's mind flashed back to the cries of the Comanche women earlier in the battle. It suddenly became clear. Parker was retreating because the village was nearby. He had to get his people on the move before the Americans arrived. While Comanche warriors on fresh mounts could evade soldiers with ease, a village filled with women, children, and elders was a different matter entirely. The villages were designed for mobility, but they still carried their materials, and their pace was far slower than mounted warriors or soldiers. As Mackenzie's forces advanced, they picked up the straggling Captain Hale, who had fled earlier. Now, with 500 soldiers at their backs, the Americans began to chase the retreating Comanche toward the Caprock Escarpment and the climb to the high plains. It was a relentless pursuit. As the Americans drew closer, the Comanche retreated up the side of a steep bluff. From the top, Comanche women screamed down at the soldiers below, urging their warriors on. The Comanche marksmen provided cover for Quanah's group as they ascended the bluff. Across the battlefield, the Tonkawa scouts hurled insults at their longtime enemies, heightening the chaos of the scene. Mackenzie's forces were not far behind. Carter, leading a group of men, charged up a narrow trail in pursuit of the fleeing warriors. The trail twisted sharply, and as his horse rounded a corner too quickly, disaster struck. Carter's legs slammed into a boulder jutting from the side of the trail, the impact echoing like the crack of a pistol. The pain was blinding. His vision faded, and the next thing he remembered was being revived by his men, who offered him water as he lay on the ground. By this time, the Comanche were disappearing into the hills and ravines. Their horses, far fresher than those of the Americans, gave them the speed and endurance needed to escape. Quanah Parker had succeeded in his mission. He had warned the village and led his warriors to safety. The Americans were left with nothing but the empty landscape. For Carter, this marked the third tragedy of Blanco Canyon, and there was still one more to come. After the Comanche had disappeared into the distance, Lieutenant Robert Carter retraced his steps to the site where Private Sander Gregg had fallen. Despite his badly injured leg, Carter, with the help of his men, ensured his friend received a proper burial. The tragic events of the day had unfolded before noon, yet by 2:30 p.m., the Tonkawa scouts reported finding the Comanche trail again. They were certain it would lead to Quanah Parker and the Comanche village. It was only then that Carter allowed himself to address his injury. His leg was swollen, stiff, and worsening. His boots had to be cut off, revealing a leg blackened with bruises, lacerated and crusted with dried blood. Although it wasn't broken, the injury was severe. The doctors splinted it as a precaution, but there was no time for further treatment. Trumpeters signaled the troops to prepare their mounts, and Carter was summoned to Colonel Ranald S. McKenzie's side. McKenzie informed Carter that some soldiers would be sent back to the fort due to their stolen mounts, which left them unable to continue the pursuit. McKenzie offered Carter the chance to return with them to receive proper medical care. Exhausted and demoralized, Carter hesitated but ultimately refused. He remembered Gregg and the purpose of their mission. His reply was resolute. "If it is left to me, I go forward with the command." Satisfied, McKenzie allowed Carter to stay but questioned him about Captain Edward Hale, whose earlier retreat had endangered the entire unit. Carter, however, refused to say more than, "Hale and his men made an error." With that, Carter mounted his horse, ignoring the pain, and continued with the expedition. The soldiers followed the Tonkawa scouts along the Brazos River, moving west toward the Caprock Escarpment. By late afternoon, they reached the edge of the canyon, which opened into a broad valley. There they found the remnants of a massive Comanche village. The village had been abandoned in haste. Over 1,000 people, 3,000 horses, and countless supplies had moved on, leaving behind lodge poles, tools, and even valuables scattered across the ground. The Comanche trail was fresh but deceptive. They had crisscrossed their path to confuse the pursuers, buying themselves precious time. Still, the Tonkawas were able to follow the signs. The army pushed forward, climbing the 1,000-foot ascent of the Caprock Escarpment, a grueling task for both soldiers and horses. Carter, grateful for his mount, marveled at how the Comanche had managed to move an entire village through such treacherous terrain. When they reached the plateau, Carter described the scene as a vast, uninterrupted plain stretching endlessly, comparable only to the ocean in its immensity. Yet, the challenges of the high plains were unforgiving. By early afternoon, temperatures dropped sharply, and a rare early-season norther was brewing. As the wind howled and temperatures plummeted, the soldiers found themselves racing against time. The Tonkawa scouts pressed on, following trails through buffalo grass and steep ravines. In the distance, silhouettes appeared on a small ridge. The Comanche village was within sight, just 2 or 3 miles ahead. But as the soldiers moved closer, the northers struck. Bitter winds, sleet, and snow battered the men and animals. Carter wrote, "The air grew thicker and more hazy. A cold rain, mingled with snow and sleet, began to drive into our faces, through our bodies, and into the very marrow." This was the supreme moment, a crisis. Despite the worsening storm, McKenzie pushed his men forward. Discarded equipment, lodge poles, tools, even buffalo skins, littered the trail, evidence of the Comanche's desperate attempt to lighten their load. Puppies, abandoned by the Comanche, whimpered in the freezing wind as soldiers scavenged useful supplies. Carter barely noticed his injured leg in the frenzy of the pursuit. The Tonkawas painted themselves for battle, preparing for what they believed would be a final confrontation. But the weather would decide otherwise. Just as the army was poised to strike, McKenzie called off the attack. Temperatures had dropped below freezing, and winds of 50 miles per hour tore through the soldiers' thin summer uniforms. McKenzie knew his men and horses could not endure much more. The storm intensified throughout the night. Soldiers constructed makeshift shelters from buffalo hides and huddled together for warmth. McKenzie himself had to be wrapped in a buffalo robe to stave off hypothermia. By morning, the storm had passed, revealing a beautiful, clear day. But it was too late. The Comanche village had vanished. The norther had given the Comanche the time they needed to escape, leaving the soldiers with nothing but frustration. They were now 40 miles from their supply lines, with rations dwindling and horses showing signs of exhaustion. McKenzie reluctantly ordered a retreat. Carter reflected bitterly. By that lucky storm for them, the Comanches still had a night's march ahead of us. The failure stung deeply. Despite their relentless pursuit, the Comanche had once again outmaneuvered the Americans. To make matters worse, on their way back to Blanco Canyon, McKenzie was wounded by an arrow during a skirmish with 2 Comanche stragglers. Another soldier was also severely injured. In the aftermath, both Carter and McKenzie recovered from their injuries, and Carter would later be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his bravery during the retreat. While the mission failed to achieve its immediate goals, it signaled a turning point. As historian S.C. Gwynn wrote, the U.S. military was signaling their intent not just to protect the frontier, but to destroy the raiders themselves, to find the wolves in the den and kill them. Within 4 years, the Comanche would be forced onto reservations. And at the forefront of this campaign was Bad Hand McKenzie, whose relentless pursuit of the Quahadi had shifted the balance of power in Comancheria forever.